So we're situated on a precarious threshold where forms of urban development and design matter profoundly to planetary futures. This talk today explores the future of cities from the perspective of mass species extinction. In order to think about designing 2118, we need to pause, to slow down, to think with the cosmos. The idea of the cosmos that I'm working with here is inspired by Isabel Stenger's. It expands both our idea of cosmos and politics in the direction of generous entanglements, where politics and planning are always relationally grounded in worldly practices of taking notice, where no one remains unaffected. We're in it together. So if you walk down a narrow laneway in the vicinity of Martin Place and George Street in the Sydney CBD, you'll encounter a canopy of 120 empty bird cages suspended between the towering skyscrapers. The installation is titled Forgotten Songs. It is designed by the artist Michael Thomas Hill, originally for a Laneway Arts Festival, and it's now a permanent installation in Angel Place, commissioned by the City of Sydney. In the artist's words, an interplay of past and present, large and small, predator and prey, Forgotten Songs engages audiences with the beauty, unexpectedness, and unfamiliarity of these displaced bird songs. The installation explores how Sydney's fauna has evolved and adapted to coexist with increased urbanisation, inviting contemplation of the city's past, its underlying landscape, and the sustainability issues associated with increased urban development. So I last encountered Forgotten Songs a few months ago during lunchtime in the CBD. Well-dressed office workers glided under the empty cages without so much as a glance upward, nor did they glance downward to the names of the absent birds etched into the pavement: eastern whipbird, fan-tailed cuckoo, leaden flycatcher, variegated fairy wren, powerful owl, white-throated nightjar, tawny frogmouth, and so on. The daytime bird songs were barely audible over the ambient city noise. To me, it seemed incredibly melancholic how the songs of the absent birds called out to a landscape no longer able to answer them. Needless to say, there's something profoundly uncanny and unsettling about Forgotten Songs. It is an allegory to ecological displacement caused by urban development. Many of the birds can still be encountered in the margins and wild pockets of the city that are still capable of supporting them. While there's an element of hope and whimsy in the project, the echo of the recorded bird song bouncing off the brick and concrete in an endless loop evokes a deeper sense of derangement, and with thanks here to Amitav Ghosh, characteristic of the urban Anthropocene. Thinking about how the space of loss and disappearance is continually performed by the empty bird cages prompts me to think more critically about the question, what is being done and thought about extinction in cities? And in relation to this panel, what does this mean for designing 2118? Do we want our cities to be echo chambers of past earthly generations, no longer capable of calling out to the world, to the cosmos, and having it answer back? So these questions are interesting, for it seems that we talk about extinction in urban contexts, but we don't precisely look into it, and I shall return to this point shortly. For example, the need to protect endangered, rare, or remnant ecological species and communities is a common cause in urban biodiversity conservation and restoration. Endangered species of plants and animals often become mired in urban development politics, where they are significant interlocutors in urban struggles over land use. The IUCN implicates urbanisation as a key factor in all of the 6 leading causes of anthropogenic extinction: habitat destruction and degradation, overexploitation, pollution, disease, invasions of alien species, and climate change. And yet, while urbanisation and extinction are irrevocably linked processes, the specific biological, political, and cultural entanglements of extinction in cities is not well understood. This creates a paradox where urbanisation is identified as a driver of anthropogenic extinction, and yet, culturally and politically, remains somehow outside of it. At the centre of the paradox is a problem familiar to scholars of the more than human city, and we've heard about this problem today: imaginations and practices that continue to reinforce boundaries between nature and culture. Urbanisation transforms pristine nature into degraded, humanised nature. And as Stephen Hinchcliffe and his co-authors wrote some 13 years ago in their essay, Urban Wild Things, a cosmopolitical experiment, these urban ecologies do not seem to count as good representatives of nature in either science or politics. And their argument is worth repeating. They write, the result is that when faced with development plans, urban wilds can seem to fall without even a cry being heard. Things don't look too rosy for urban wilds, not pure enough to be true, not human enough to be political. Urban wilds have no constituency. So extinction in cities follows a similar logic. When it comes into focus, it tends to be on scientific and development impacts of urbanisation on particular endangered or vulnerable species. Bigger questions of how these impacts are entangled within various and complex socio-ecological assemblages of crisis, hope, and neglect tend to be overlooked. What is missing is an understanding of what Nate Gabriel refers to as the multiplicity of forces that collude in producing the urban, and what Debbie Rose and her co-authors articulate as the complexity and ethical significance of specific sites of loss. The former insight is a key tenet of urban political ecology, a field of research that recognises cities as socio-ecological hybrids that are co-produced by humans and non-humans, the outcomes of which are entangled in spatially uneven relations of power. The latter insight draws on recent work on extinction studies in the environmental humanities that understands extinction as a specific form of collective death, sometimes quiet, sometimes violent, but always with intergenerational consequences for multitudes of earthly inhabitants. It would seem that extinction, real and imagined, falls through the gaps of urban everyday life. So we need a more nuanced and complex understanding of what is happening with cities and extinction, and certainly this extends beyond the boundaries of the urban. Such an understanding brings urban planning, architecture and design, and the environmental humanities into a deeper and more critical conversation. It involves moving the framework for adjudicating urban biodiversity loss beyond drivers and impacts and into the interwoven multi-species realms of urban imaginaries, politics and practices, and I think we've just seen a really good example of that. It involves processes and practices of what Debbie Rose refers to as looking into extinction, to the responsibilities, ethics and care involved, and being more attuned to what the loss of specific beings, their work and appearance in the world means for diverse humans and non-human communities. Rick DeVos sums it up nicely. He says, extinction in its officially articulated context affords us the opportunity to take a step back from a space of absence and loss, to view it through the protective lens of science and history, separating our bodies from those we once shared space and time and who have now been killed or killed off. So in the not much time remaining, I just want to discuss some brief examples of what life at the edges in cities might entail. So I'm going to talk about animals, but I want to acknowledge the multitudes of earthly life forms and entanglements that are caught up in mass extinction. So animals at the edges of extinction in cities are situated in contested socio-ecological and cultural spaces. Exploring these edges provides new opportunities for rethinking the everyday contexts of multi-species cities. The fragile lives of urban animals, whether they are captive or in the wild, whether they represent the archived memories of species and individuals already gone, or involve those who are struggling to survive, raise significant questions about how extinction is entangled within particular urban imaginaries and forms of memory work. Cities are often sites where the last or the soon-to-be extinct live out the end of their lineages, or where their existence is furtively and often violently prolonged in captive breeding programs in zoos. Within these urban sites and institutions, the last of living kinds occupy liminal spaces at the threshold of life and death. These last beings sometimes transcend Western categories of animal or species. and are regarded as individual, as in the case of Martha here, the last of the passenger pigeons who died at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1914 and whose preserved body is on display at the Smithsonian Institute of Washington, D.C. The recognition of life and death, the life and death of specific animals, is a site of creative and political tension, mourning and possibility. Dolly Jurgensen notes the liminal power of such endlings, as she calls them, evoked by artists, writers, museum curators, in search for poignant and memorable narratives to remember the species we have lost and to encourage action to avoid more extinction in the future. And this is a theme that's also expressed by street artists on the previous slide. Famously Banksy, but also the 13 artists involved in the Endangered 13 mural project at Tower Hamlets in London. Okay. So, returning to Martha and George, the last of the passenger pigeons, whose migratory flights once numbered in the millions, the skies darkening with the swiftly moving flocks passing overhead. It seems unthinkable that such beautiful abundance declined into scarcity and then into nothing at all. In Perth, Western Australia, people are currently witnessing a similar catastrophic decline in two beloved species of endemic black cockatoos, Carnaby's cockatoo and forest red-tailed cockatoos. While black cockatoos still flock over Perth skies, crying out their unique call, they do so in smaller and smaller numbers. The bright wheeling flocks of hundreds of birds in joyful flight, now mostly lost to memory. The sharp decline in populations is primarily caused by woodland clearing and urban development. Black cockatoos are directly imbricated in urban struggles over housing, infrastructure, and rights to the city. Their messy interaction with urban governance, public and private property development interests, biodiversity offsetting, land use planning, and some conservation practices are revealing a grim situation where planning may ultimately fail to save a species that people want and are fighting to keep. In the arts of living on a damaged planet, Elaine Garn and her co-authors write that living arrangements that took millions of years to put into place are being undone in the blink of an eye. This is happening in Perth and in many other cities, one interstitial patch of not very good nature at a time. In Perth, black cockatoos are interlocutors in this story of planning death and damage. And perhaps they may help to imagine and enact what Vinciane Desprez calls new practices of earthly companionship in urban settings. Practices that emerge out of attentiveness to and alliances with other manners and kinds of being. In a recent article published in Planning Theory, my co-authors and I reflected on what Donna Haraway's concept of making kin might mean for planning cities. Haraway, like Stangers and like Desprez, is a great philosopher of derangement. She forces thought out of present complacencies and path dependencies and helps us to imagine what might be otherwise if we take responsibilities and entanglements seriously. We called for planners to make kin, not cities, for as Haraway asserts, making kin is not necessarily making kind, that is, designing echo chambers where only our own perspectives are echoed back. What if we plan and design multi-species cities? In Perth, perhaps black cockatoos will help people to slow down and to learn to inhabit differently shared and unknown urban futures, or perhaps they will go extinct. This is the edge, the threshold. Looking into extinction in the contested spaces of the city requires reorienting urban ecological imaginations to be attentive to what Tom Van Doren in Flightways insists is at the heart of the matter. The varied, complex, conflicted spaces in which diverse relationships, diverse multi-species communities emerge as possibilities of life and death for everyone, not just the endangered, are remade. And this is what I think designing 2118 should be about. It should be about striving for a cosmo-ecological city, reshaped by thinking and being in the presence of others, in the presence of the cosmos, to live in responsibility to earthly connections, to move away from designing cities primarily to overcome the limitations of nature, but to learn to inhabit it more fully. Thank you.